Hey, before we get started, I want to remind you that Truce is listener supported. If you want to be a part of this one-of-a-kind show that asks big questions in an approachable way, become a patron. For just $5 a month, you can help me tell big stories like this upcoming season on the history of fundamentalism. And you'll get access to bonus materials. That's all at patreon.com/trucepodcast. That's patreon.com/trucepodcast. This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of season 6. Not only do we need to understand how Christians were pulled in, but we also need to understand how the Republican Party changed in the 1900s. This episode won't talk much about Christianity, but it's key to understanding the Republican Party of the 1970s, one of the areas we're spending a lot of time in this season. This is the Long Southern Strategy. Okay, here we go. Dexter Chips was a Catholic man, in a time when Protestants didn't much like Catholics. He was a strong supporter of the mayor of Fort Worth, Texas, and the owner of a lumber yard. On July 17, 1926, Chips got on the phone and called a pastor who was speaking out against the mayor. He'd said that he was not fit to be the mayor of a hog pen. The call, as you can imagine, did not go well. So Chips stomped off to confront the pastor. The two men exchanged words, their arguments grew loud, and Chips challenged the pastor to a fight. It turns out he picked the wrong man to mess with. The pastor drew a pistol from his desk drawer and fired 4 shots. 3 bullets pierced Chips and killed him. The pastor called his wife and the police saying, "I just killed a man." The pastor in question is somewhat of a controversial figure, one you've probably never heard of before. His name was J. Frank Norris. He embodied what one writer described as your stereotypical vision of a Texas fundamentalist. Brash. He was hired in 1909 by the First Baptist Church in Fort Worth, known as the Church of the Cattle Kings. He was also nearly convicted of arson when his own church burned down, and he got away with shooting Dexter Chips on the grounds of self-defense. 33 prominent Texas Baptists signed a statement describing Norris as divisive, self-centered, autocratic, hypocritical, and non-cooperative. Then, a year later, the Baptist General Convention of Texas kicked him out. Norris was a founder of the World's Christian Fundamentals Association. Fundamentalism, if you'll remember, began as a movement to fight modernist theology, that belief system that said you could remove the miraculous from Christianity. Maybe Jesus never rose from the dead or walked on water. Norris preached against modernists often, which is notable because in the 1920s, there wasn't really a modernist movement in the South. For that reason, there really weren't fundamentalists in the South in the 1920s. When the Scopes Monkey trial was held in Tennessee, in the South, it came as a surprise when the region was painted as fundamentalist by the press, because it wasn't. Fundamentalism in the early years was a northern phenomenon. Young men trained in a seminary and then went on to spread fundamentalism wherever they were placed. Norris is credited by some historians as bringing the movement below the Mason-Dixon line. The American South is an interesting and dynamic place, one that is often misunderstood. Today we associate it with fundamentalist religion and the Republican Party, but that wasn't always the case. A lot changed over the decades from the 1920s to the 70s. This season, I'm telling the story of how some evangelical Christians tied themselves to the Republican Party. To do that, we have to understand not just Christianity, but also changes in the GOP. Because the party of today, or even of Ronald Reagan, was not the party of the early 1900s. But the time would come when the Republicans saw the South as a voting bloc. White Southerners had long voted for the Democrats, but that would all change as they were courted not by a pastor tried for murder, but by a presidential candidate who claimed he was not a crook. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. As a part of that mission, Where You're From is a podcast for those who believe it's important to stop and listen before we speak. Join us on each episode as we ask another Christian thought leader where you're from and discover how their life experiences and expertise, even if we may disagree with something they say, offers us important perspectives worth thinking about. To see our list of guests, visit whereyou'refrom.org today. That's whereyafrom.org. I'm Russell Berry, reminding you that it's not just about where you're at, but it's also about where you're from.
How did Republicans, the party of Lincoln, start vying for the South? To explore that topic today, I spoke with a fascinating guest.
My name is Angie Maxwell. I am the Diane D. Blair Endowed Chair in Southern Studies and a professor of political science at the University of Arkansas.
Author of The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. I like talking to her about the South because not only does she study it, but maybe you noticed, she's Southern. Okay, so the American South fights in the Civil War. And loses. Then the North occupies the South to enforce laws. This leads to white Southerners doing everything they can to keep black people down. Jim Crow laws, black codes, and yes, the North does some of this too. White Southerners also develop, and this will be important, a kind of inferiority complex.
Probably the worst thing that white Southerners thought could happen if they lost the war is that people would be bankrupt, right? And how would they have labor? And how would they process an agricultural economy? They never thought their slaves would be their senators, right? That was not something that was imagined. And it was not something that happened outside of the region either. So that experience of being the scrutiny, totally deserved, not defending it, right? Totally deserved. But that experience of the world turned upside down to such an extreme degree, to me, created a kind of a tender skin to criticism.
This belief that the rest of the country looks down on them. The North keeps putting us down, changing our laws, messing with our way of life. They define themselves by this wound that we're somehow seen as less by the rest of the country because we're the South, tied to the Democrats, the party of Jim Crow. But that political party starts changing. It backs stuff like the New Deal, which might, heaven help us, provide aid to poor people, some of whom are black. Then, in 1945, Harry Truman becomes president of the United States.
Truman makes a speech to the NAACP. He's the first president to make a speech to the NAACP. And he doubles down on kind of the direction the National Democratic Party is going.
It is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. And when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans.
And then, of course, the desegregating the military by executive order.
And remember, he was a Democrat, what had been the party of Jim Crow. That leaves racists and Southerners looking to either reform the Democrats to take them back to their old ways or look for a new party.
So 1948, Truman re-election becomes kind of the watershed moment. But Southern Democrats feel like, well, we're just going to get rid of this guy, right? We'll get somebody good in there as our nominee. When Truman succeeds in getting the nomination at the 1948 convention, Southern Democrats get worried. They really see this kind of slipping away, their national party slipping away, and they walk out, not all of them, but most of them, and they run their own candidate in Strom Thurmond.
Strom Thurmond, one of those names you probably heard in history class all those years ago, but maybe forgot. He'd been a lawyer, state senator of South Carolina, participated in D-Day in Normandy, and was then governor of South Carolina. Super into states' rights and segregation. We'll hear from him later on, so try to remember Strom Thurmond. This splinter group of the Democratic Party makes him their nominee to run against Harry Truman. Some folks in the South were so against Truman that he didn't even appear on the ballot in Alabama. This group calls themselves the Dixiecrats. But the Dixiecrats failed.
It's close, as we all know, the famous picture of saying, Truman held up the newspaper that said Dewey won, but Truman is successful. And that puts the kind of Southern white segregationist, pro-Jim Crow Democrats into kind of a purgatory of sorts.
Because, yeah, you've got a Democrat in the White House, but it's Truman. Now, who's the next president in line? Do you remember?
Good evening, my fellow Americans. First, I should like to express my gratitude.
Dwight Eisenhower. But he was so beloved that both parties wanted him. In the 1950s, a study showed that the parties were similar enough that a large part of the population couldn't tell which was conservative and which was liberal. That must have made the racists and Southerners crazy. How could they keep black people down without their guy running the country? Eisenhower, the Republican, sends troops to Arkansas to enforce the integration of schools in Little Rock in 1957. Anathema to Southerners who hadn't touched the presidency in years. To oversimplify it, racist Southerners sat out the presidency of Truman. Then again for 8 years of Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy became president, and he was far from perfect, but also not the hardcore racist they wanted. Then comes Lyndon Johnson, whose Great Society programs benefit poor people. And just like the New Deal, some of that money went to black people. An idea untenable to racists. Administration after administration, the hardcore racists don't get their kind of Democrat in the presidency. Yeah, they are definitely able to get away with atrocities, especially at the state and local levels. But they want a racist big cheese, or at least someone who will stop undermining them. What if, and this sounds crazy, what if they become Republicans in 1964? Running for the Republican nomination were two major candidates. One was Nelson Rockefeller. Yes, from that Rockefeller family. He ran the liberal wing of the Republican Party. He also ticked off a group of Republicans.
Some John Birch Society members are upset. Some union busting Republicans are upset. And they start to feel like the wealthy Rockefeller Republicans, the East Coast and West Coast, more liberal Republicans, are just manipulating the party and they're just controlling everything. And that conservative faction starts meeting and talking about trying to, where can we find bedfellows, right? How do we grow our wing of the party?
They're thinking maybe we can bring some white Southerners to the party. After all, there's this big bunch of unrepresented racists just waiting to back the right candidate. They did not like Rockefeller, too liberal and elitist. So they backed Barry Goldwater. You may not remember that name, but he comes up a lot when discussing the radical shift of the Republican Party.
Senator from Arizona, he's one of the few Republicans that have voted against the Civil Rights Act. They think he's dynamic. He had made some pretty aggressive speeches against Eisenhower being soft on unions. It's a long shot for him to get the nomination to a degree, but Nelson Rockefeller, who the other wing of the Republican Party had put up, was newly remarried to a former staffer with whom he'd had a affair, and she was having a baby, and it just brought some of those kind of social taboos, specifically at that time, and decreased his popularity. And so Goldwater squeaks it out. And this conservative faction of the Republican Party has their moment. That they send a team of people that stump in the South hard for Goldwater, and they use some pretty explicit language about, Goldwater will not enforce any of these, civil rights changes. And they're worried about the Voting Rights Act, which is looming on the horizon, because that's the one that really could change the political structure in the region.
The Voting Rights Act made poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation at voting places, that kind of stuff, illegal, and would be passed by President Johnson in 1965. A Democrat. Racists obviously didn't want this to pass because it would mean they could no longer play their usual tricks and their people would be voted out of office.
So Mississippi goes in the 80 percentile for Goldwater.
White Southerners eat up the rhetoric of Barry Goldwater. A Republican, a man from the party of Lincoln, takes a formerly Democratic state by appealing to white racists. This is the power of Barry Goldwater, and why he's worth remembering. He demonstrates that Republicans can make headway in the South.
So it's nuts, right? So the messaging was very effective, very effective. What Goldwater believed personally is, not something I can assess, but how he was portrayed in the region on that tour through the South called Operation Dixie that his team did was explicitly anti-civil rights and pro-segregation.
Does that mean he wins because he speaks to racists?
No, he wins 5 deep South states and his home state of Arizona, and he loses everywhere else in the country.
He loses. Okay. Did your brain wander off? This is a lot of names. So let me impress upon you this important thing. After losing presidential elections time and again, hardcore racists who had been Democrats got courted by a Republican, Barry Goldwater. Yes, he failed, but he demonstrated that a Republican, the party that freed the slaves, that consistently lost elections in the South, can court Southern voters. All it takes is the right messaging.
The kind of Rockefeller wing of the party,
The liberal wing of the Republican Party,
was like, yeah, see, look, told you, right? Good luck with that. And kind of thinks that they'll just go back to being the party in power, right?
we let the right have their fun and they lost the vast majority of the states. Time to get real. Let's get Richard Nixon up to bat.
And in a sense, Nixon in 68 is a compromise candidate, right? Nixon had been the candidate in 60. He'd almost won. And he'd run a pretty pro-civil rights campaign. If you compared Nixon's 1960 campaign, Nixon's 1968 campaign, they are wildly different.
You can hear that in one of his televised campaign ads from 1960.
I want to talk to you for a moment about civil rights, equal rights for all our citizens. Why must we vigorously defend them? First, because it is right and just. And second, because we cannot compete successfully with communism if we fail to utilize completely the minds and energies of all of our citizens.
Why should we work for equal rights? To beat the communists. Classic 1960.
That's right. And he courted the black vote outside of the South, particularly in some of the urban areas and big cities. He had somewhat of a friendship and communication back and forth with MLK. He had gone on record after Brown v. Board, when he was vice president under Eisenhower, saying that the Warren Court had made the correct decision.
Backing school integration. Not the guy you'd think would turn and give in to the racist wing of the party in order to court the South.
The Goldwater wing, this conservative faction, they don't have a kind of a leg to stand on after Goldwater's terrible showing. And Nixon, of course, is still very bitter about the close loss in 60.
When Nixon lost by a thin margin to JFK.
And so the strategists think, well, we can't put another Goldwater out there because the party's not going to stand for it, and look what happened. But if we can take a well-known person, and if we can skate the middle here, build on some of the gains Goldwater made in these deep South states, but code the language in a way that doesn't offend so many Republicans outside of the region and kind of the Rockefeller Republicans, we might have a winning combination.
We need to look moderate, but also send a message to the South that we're on their side. We just can't do it outright. We have to be sly. In doing so, maybe we can tip the scales to win a presidency. Flashback to earlier in this episode. I asked you to remember Strom Thurmond, the South Carolina Democrat who wasn't thrilled with Harry Truman's civil rights ideas and created the Dixiecrats. Ran against Truman and almost won. Super racist. Remember that guy? He said, quote, "All the laws of Washington and all the bayonets of the army cannot force the Negro into our homes, our schools, our churches, and our places of recreation." End quote. Since losing the Democratic nomination, he switched parties. Now he was an influential Republican working from the inside.
I mean, there was a young super conservative named Ronald Reagan that was trying to make headway in that 68 primary. And it was actually Strom Thurmond who convinced these newly converted Southern Democrats turned Republicans at the convention. He said, "I know you think Reagan's the true conservative, but Nixon has assured us that he will not enforce civil rights changes. We've got to stick with him." and he wielded that power. And it's not like there was huge numbers of white Southern delegates at the time, or that were super influential. They were somewhat new to the party. But when a party split down the middle, any group that can tip the balance, has a lot of power.
With the help of Strom Thurmond, they tipped the scales for the Republicans, and the conservative wing of the Republican Party got their man nominated for president, Richard Nixon.
And Nixon recognized, too, that, George Wallace was going to enter the race as a third-party candidate, and that Wallace was the segregationist governor of Alabama.
You may know George Wallace from the song Sweet Home Alabama. When he was inaugurated as governor of that state, he said,
"I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever."
Just in case you had any doubts about where he stood, the guy's running as a third-party candidate. And obviously, he's going to take the hardcore racists.
You can't out anti-civil rights George Wallace in 1968, right? So your option is really only to go towards the middle.
That is what Nixon did. He was the middle guy. He was Eisenhower's VP. Remember the 1950s? Remember how nice they were? After all the tumult of Kennedy's assassination and student protests, Nixon had nostalgia on his side. But his team still wanted to court the South.
George Wallace is going to win the kind of hardline segregationist votes, but Nixon picks up enough support to win the South. So it didn't work with Goldwater, but with some fine tuning, this long-standing attachment of Southern white, Democrats to the Democratic Party has somewhat been broken,
leaving an opportunity for Republicans, bringing us to a moment that borders on legend. The details of the meeting are sketchy. Folks are not likely to take good notes on backroom deals. But Nixon's trying to gain the nomination of his party, and of course, there was the option of courting the South. To do that, he had to kiss the ring of Strom Thurmond. The two met in a hotel room in Atlanta on June 1st, 1968. One historian said that it was the most important event in the election of that year. Another compared it to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes that won him the presidential election but ended Reconstruction in the South and protection for black people. Essentially, it amounted to a commitment to benign neglect. Yes, Brown v. Board of Education was a done deal, ending separate but equal in public schools. But that didn't mean that the federal government had to enforce it. Whatever the exact details, Nixon and Thurmond entered the hotel ballroom where the state chairs were gathered. A few weeks later, Strom Thurmond formally supported Nixon.
We do see a very changed Nixon in that campaign. And we do see Strom Thurmond, who naturally would have maybe endorsed a Wallace, right? Decide not to.
Now, Nixon couldn't just come out and bash black people like Wallace had because he'd alienate the party's base that wasn't racist. Instead, it came down to benign neglect and dog whistles. The dog whistle term gets used a lot these days, and there are those who deny that Nixon used them, like Dinesh D'Souza. But it seems clear that there was a major change in Nixon's behavior. And it's hard to deny because there was a literal playbook released as a best-selling book called The Emerging Republican Majority by Nixon staffer Kevin Phillips that pretty much lays out the plan.
What they mean by a political dog whistle is, and they're really hard to do now because of media and technology, is saying something in a way that a certain community hears it and knows what you mean, even if other folks who hear that take a totally different meaning from it.
The term dog whistle comes from whistles that put out a frequency so high that only dogs can hear them.
And a dog whistle isn't necessarily bad, depending on its context, right? You may be just trying to communicate something to a community.
Like when a candidate says, "I was tried in the wilderness," or "though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death," it signals to people who know their Bible that this candidate understands Scripture, or is religious. To those who don't get the reference, it's just a folksy saying. To true believers, it says, "This person gets me."
Example would be kind of Law and Order.
This audio is from a 1968 campaign ad for Nixon. Remember how Angie said there was a big difference between the Nixon campaigns of 1960 and 68? Well, here it is. Instead of a calm Nixon chatting into the lens, This one has a stern narration over photographs of burning buildings and officers with what looks like tear gas launchers.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Nixon spoke about law and order in his speeches and when accepting the Republican nomination. Yet, when some people heard law and order, they took it to mean control over black people. In other words, a dog whistle.
I mean, there's tons of people in the country that hear law and order and think law and order.
Right.
That's what they think they mean, right?
Great TV show, yeah.
Right. Great TV show. That's exactly right. And who, it's a very, who doesn't want there to be, order and laws obeyed and followed? But that phrase in the South was messaged to say an end to the protests, the civil rights protests, an end to the boycotts and the organizing and a crackdown. That spoke to a lot of white Southerners who felt that kind of the civil rights beat that journalists, that every major newspaper has after Emmett Till in 1955, of covering all of these protests and stuff in the South, just making the South look terrible. There's people all the way from that to people fearing that they're going to erupt into violence. What I'm always trying to push myself to think about is the actual lived experience of people. And when you think about white communities in the South during segregation, for so many decades, it was like a coexistence that was so separated that it wasn't in your face all the time. So it was real easy to kind of pretend this is just how life is and this is just peaceful, right? It was really easy to not see some things for kind of your average, kind of white Southerner living this existence in the kind of separated white world. And even nonviolent protests, which they were in the South, it pops that bubble where people believed that that African Americans supported segregation too, that they wanted to live in their own separate space or whatever mythology, or this was good for them, or it was paternalistic. This is just how life was supposed to be. Well, the protests, even nonviolent, showed them, no, African American community does not want this, that this has hurt and oppressed. And then the media, once again, calling all of it out. It's pretty hard to keep that conditioned life lie going, that this is all benevolent. And so law and order meant we're not going to have these walkouts and protests. And that spoke to a lot of kind of moderate, honestly, white Southerners who, just wanted a system that was polite. Just kind of polite racism. Racism they didn't want to see.
By the way, Nixon denied that terms like law and order were codes for racism. This clip comes from a 1968 televised town hall in Georgia.
Mr. Nixon, what would you do as president to bring law and order back to America, and what is your definition of law and order?
Well, let me start with the definition first. By law and order, I mean law and order for everybody. And let me lay one thing right on the line at the beginning. I know that it has been suggested that law and order is a code word for racism. I don't buy that at all. Let's understand that as far as law and order is concerned, that black Americans have just as great a stake in law and order as white Americans have.
Yet to white Southerners, law and order signaled an end of the protests and reestablishment of the old way. Again, they didn't need to reach the extreme racists. George Wallace did that. Law and order, though, could appeal to modern white Southerners in a way that outright racism couldn't. Hence the dog whistle.
In this case, they were very concerned about communicating it so directly as they did, as the surrogates did for Goldwater, that it is off-putting to those moderates who didn't want to be thought of badly, right? Didn't want to be called out for being racist. Didn't support violence, but just wanted things to stay the way they were and not be called racist. The hardliner appeal didn't work for them either. These are the people that didn't want to vote for Wallace, but they didn't want complete and total social change.
And the South went for Nixon. But African Americans certainly felt the change in mood from Nixon. In 1960, 40% of African American voters went with Nixon. In 68, only 13% of non-white voters went with him. That's a huge change. Despite what Nixon said on TV and what D'Souza claims today, African Americans clearly picked up on the dog whistles. They were aware in the moment what was going on. Then there's this idea of neglect. What we believe isn't just signaled by what we do, but also what we don't do.
There's a continued effort by a lot of Southern governors, for example, to block integration into different universities and into different spaces. And you do not see an Eisenhower level response.
Where you're sending in soldiers.
Right. Yeah. So people saying, this was the administration you were part of and you supported that. And then you see the same thing happening in other southern universities and other towns, and there's just no action, right? And at that point, those laws are in place. Eisenhower took action when you didn't have a Civil Rights Act in place. Then you do get a Civil Rights Act in place. And you do not see executive action when those laws are violated, right?
You'll see something like maybe the Kent State shooting, which was about war protests. They send in the military then, but not
Correct.
To protect African Americans. Yeah.
The expectations were different after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, those were such enormous efforts. And we just don't see an executive response anywhere near what had happened 10 years prior.
And you see the rise of segregation academies where white people send their kids to private schools rather than have them integrated. And government dollars start flowing in that direction, like in the state of Virginia, which offered grants to draw teachers to private schools.
So it's the benign neglect. It's what Nixon didn't do compared to what people expected. What racist thing did he say? It's not that. It's that the country gets a civil rights law passed and the executive does nothing to enforce it.
This is going to be important in a few months when we talk about school integration and busing, because one of the key issues that draws white evangelicals to the Republican Party in the Carter administration is fear of losing tax-exempt status due to enforcement of integration laws. It's a wild story, and honestly, one that we tend to tell the wrong way. So please pray for me, because it's going to be a tough episode to make. Anyhow, note that this disjointed arc from Harry Truman to Richard Nixon demonstrates how the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, changed its attitudes towards African Americans in order to court the Southern white vote. Nixon wins 2 terms and eventually resigns after the Watergate scandal, as discussed in the last episode. It's tempting to end the story there. But what I appreciate about Angie Maxwell's work is that she studies what she calls the long Southern strategy. The South does not stay with the Republican Party after Nixon's resignation. In the following election, it's Gerald Ford against Jimmy Carter. The Democrat wins the South.
What Jimmy Carter portrayed is that he was one of them.
A white Southerner. Really, there isn't anything easy about this moment. It's tangled. But the South goes for the Democrats under Carter. Then it goes for Reagan, and it seems like the Republicans have their attention once more, until Bill Clinton comes along and wins it back for the Democrats. The Southern strategy didn't always work for the Republicans. It isn't a straight line like it's sometimes portrayed. Again, the South is a dynamic place, just like anywhere else.
It's such a simple explanation, right? The Civil Rights Act passed, and all of a sudden all these Southern white Democrats become Republicans. I mean, nothing works like that. It's so much more complicated, and there was a lot of infighting in the Republican Party. Lots of Republicans are very upset about, this trying to appeal to this idea about appealing to white Southerners. It was very, very mixed and tumultuous time.
And it will take time to fit all the pieces together this season, because so much was happening all at the same time. We haven't even touched on women's liberation, the ERA, the anti-ERA movement, supply-side economics, changes in theology, the new right. We'll get to all that. And it's fascinating. Race is just one part of what changes the Republican Party, and just one component of what nudges some evangelicals to support them. It would be a mistake to pin it all on just one part of this complicated story. Settle in, gang. We've got plenty more to cover. For now, let's circle back to J. Frank Norris at the beginning of this episode, the brash love him or hate him preacher who shot a man and also introduced fundamentalism to the South. fundamentalism wasn't really there until he brought it to Texas with his trademark fear and anxiety. By the end of the century, fundamentalist Christianity would overtake denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention. Norris and men like him laid the groundwork for that decades earlier. Racism and a bunch of other issues would converge to swing party politics and drive evangelicals to make strange bedfellows in order to become a voting bloc. One of the ways they did this was by convincing us that not only is the South looked down upon, but so are Christians. Same playbook, different target. Norris brought that fear to the South. A host of others tried to hitch it to the gospel. Listen to preachers on radio or on TV. Do you hear that Christians are being left behind, overlooked, that our way of life is disappearing? Whether or not you agree with that statement, do you like what gets marketed with it? It's the same language that convinced the South that they had to use force to keep their way of life. In the Christian world, it's not fear of the North occupying our territory that riles us up. It's concern that those people or the government are coming for our children, that they're using textbooks to turn your kids against God, that the media and society look down on us, say we're backwards. We're constantly being told that we're a benighted people and that the elites are coming for us. Do we want to live our lives to run our ministries like that? Is it a statement of fact that we're looked down upon, or is that a Trojan horse meant to manipulate us? Is it possible that political forces need us to believe that, so we'll vote for them? And honestly, what could we do if we stopped being afraid and started living out the basic work of the gospel? Special thanks to the amazing Angie Maxwell. Her books are The Long Southern Strategy and The Benighted South. Patrons of the show can hear a lot more good stuff with her by giving a little each month to help the show at patreon.com/trucepodcast. We had a much longer conversation than what I could fit into this episode. She was so generous with her time. Thanks also to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including my friends Jackie Hart and Chris Sloan. Truce is listener supported. Please also take time to tell your friends and family about the show. This is a small independent operation. There is no marketing staff, so your help telling others really goes a long way. I made 2 versions of this episode. The first one had more information in it, but I had to cut it back in hopes of making more sense. Patrons of the show can hear the original version at patreon.com/trucepodcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. This episode is brought to you by the Compelled Podcast. What would you do if you came face to face with a murderer sent to kill you for being a Christian? For Virginia Prodan, that question isn't hypothetical. Virginia was a small, petite attorney defending Christians in court in communist Romania. And she was really good. So good, in fact, she caught the attention of the communist regime. One day, a tall, muscular man walked into her office, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down. I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next would surprise both of them. Listen to Virginia's entire story on the Compelled Podcast, where they find incredible true life stories of God working through the lives of normal people. Virginia is on episode number 31, which is titled, He Came to Kill Me. Listen on your podcasting app or at compelledpodcast.com.